All right. Hello, everybody. I see people streaming in from the waiting room. Welcome here today. It's uh, it's good to have you. My name is Josh Wachtel, and I'm the communications director for Building a New Reality banner. And Ted Wachtel, the founder, is here as well today. And we we have a great topic, the systematic use of citizens' assemblies in governance, probability, or pipe dream. And we're so glad that you've joined us today. So, as is our tradition, we love to have people chat in, and I think I've remembered to turn all that function on today. Where you're coming from, and if you have any professional interest in this field, that would be great to know.
Do
But let
the
us
everyone
where.
setting. Make sure people do the everyone setting on chat.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a blue box, and if you don't click it, you'll only chat to the panelists. Uh, so click everyone so that we can all see where you're from. And I will put where I'm from as well today. All right. Lovely. Colombia, our New Zealand, England,
Staffordshire,
Ireland. We always get such a great international. Allentown, Washington, D.C. Great.
Netherlands,
Oh,
Asheville, North Carolina,
all right.
Zionsville, Michigan.
So, you know, most of the folks who join these calls are familiar with restorative practices. Many of them know Ted uh, in his role as president of the International Institute for Restorative Practices Graduate School. I know there's folks often on the call who go back many, many years with restorative practices. And so, but we've also been getting increasingly folks from the deliberative democracy world. I see Ian Tresoyer from works with Democracy Without Elections, one of our organizations we're really fans of in the US. Democracy Without Elections is advocating for the use of the kind of things we're going to be talking about today in the US. But restorative practices at its essence is improving relationships, increasing the ability of people in all kinds of settings to get along, deal with hard things, make decisions, work through conflict, and function better. Folks have done a lot of work in schools, in social work, in the justice field, where, all kinds of things from just the way you talk one-on-one with a student or a client or anybody that you're working with, that falls into restorative. But then, we have small groups of people who are talking to try to resolve, or larger circles and formal conferences people may be familiar with in family work, in justice. So really, these kind of processes. And then over the last 10 years, as my dad stepped down from being the president of the IIRP, he's been looking to expand the field of restorative even more. And so he's taken a deep dive, and as we all have, many of you folks have been, coming to these events for several years now, but looking at large group decision making and processes like citizens' assemblies, lotocracy, there's a number of terms and there's a number of processes that can be done in different jurisdictions, whether it's a town, a city, a state, or a country, and maybe beyond. So, Ted, I know you wanted to say a few words as well, just to get things started here before we invite our very special guests on.
Well, thanks. I'm really excited to see the diversity of locales here. Thank you so much for coming. And I don't have a speech. I just wanted to make a few comments. First of all, I spent 4 days 2 weeks ago in one of Jim Fishkin's or James Fishkin's um, deliberative polls, which is a type of citizens assembly where you don't choose solutions and write original ones, but rather you are in the same kinds of discussions with other groups of people, but essentially choosing among existing choices. And you've been polled on them, and then you take the poll again, so to speak, after you deliberate. And I finally got to go to one. It's the first citizens assembly type thing I've ever been at. And what was fun about one is I just followed one room. They have smaller groups of 15 people. There were 175. By the way, Hillary Clinton showed up as one of the experts, which was a surprise. And, the governor of Pennsylvania was at the beginning. So people are taking this kind of deliberative for these kinds of deliberative formats seriously. And what was really helpful to me, and I guess why I'm so happy that Marjan Asasi is here, her new book, Activated Citizenship, is essentially, I guess she's telling us all about the work she did in her own dissertation and studying four citizens' assemblies in four countries. I'm not going to talk about that in detail. One was in the States at the recent Petaluma conference, others, the French climate. But what was important for me is that I have a little cheat sheet here, by the way, uh, five variables that she identified in her book as what she was looking at when she was interviewing people and thinking about each of these assemblies she's attended. So just quickly, epistemic growth, so the cognitive dimension, how people explain to each other and learn and make better decisions. Connectedness, the relational dimension, how they get along and bond and so forth. I love this one, effervescence, which is the emotional dimension. Uh, the political engagement, so the behavioral dimension, people coming from lots of different political positions, talking about many of these sensitive issues, how do they behave, and the consequential voice, whether people perceive their voices mattering. And I have to tell you, there was a lot of epistemic growth. People helped each other. They explained things to each other. And it was interesting because they were clearly at times at quite odds, but they had joined a new group. They were members of a group of about 15 people that they came to trust. And I was just, since I watched for 4 days, watched them progress. And the effervescence grew. People were really happy about it. Uh, anyway, and I saw a little bit of that, a preview of that in Patrick Chalmers' the two films. Josh, you're going to put up something about his where people can find his films. I think he had a
I
YouTube.
can do that now.
Yeah, but the two that really struck me the most were When Citizens Assemble and another called Teaching Peace, which is a really interesting title because it's about the first one is about the Citizens Assembly uh, for abortion in Ireland. So on a macro scale, what's a Citizens Assembly look like? What are the implications and so on? The second one took place at a neighborhood level, micro as could be. Um, in Malawi, and people were actually put in the position of essentially auditors, given the authority to challenge local officials to say, "Where's our money going?" They get these funds contributed by their member of parliament, and that was a whole different way of looking at a citizens' assembly. It was a very practical, mundane, but both assemblies are randomly selected people. So the whole idea of sortition or lotocracy um, is well displayed. Anyway, I'm so excited that they're here. I'm going to shut up. And Josh, I don't know if you had any.
Yeah, no, I just want to add that, what I think the angle we're coming from, which may be different from our guests or maybe different from some of the folks in the deliberative democracy field, is that we are interested in an ethical change in society where no matter at what level, whether it's a neighborhood or a city, there's an idea when there's a problem, we need more people involved, not fewer people. We need more people involved in serious ways, and there are a lot of ways that that can be done. And we'll be talking about our guests will be talking about some of those ways today. So, sound good? All right. So, Dad, I'll ask you to turn off, and I'm gonna invite our first guest, Marjan Asasi, to join. Her organization is FIDE North America, And she's also recently published a book, which I'm sure she'll mention, and we'll post a link to that through the course of this day. But Marjan, I'm going to give the floor to you now.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Josh. And thank you, Ted. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you for inviting me to speak about my work. And it's great to be here with Patrick, whose work I really respect and admire. Thank you also, Ted, for going through the variables. I really appreciate that. I thought maybe with the 10-15 minutes that I have, I'll just talk to you a little bit about sort of my background, how I came to this work, and just share with you the ways in which we think about some of the deficits that we see across the United States, certainly, but also in other places. And then talk about citizens' assemblies just very briefly, the way that we define them, and then end with some conversation around how we see the impact of assemblies and the ways in which we think about that. So I came to the work, to my work in citizens' assemblies through my doctoral thesis. I had been spending about almost 15 years in international development with organizations like the World Bank, the National Democratic Institute, always working from a governance and a rule of law lens. And after 2016, really felt like I wanted to sort of pivot and do some more work here in the United States. Went back to school at Johns Hopkins to get my doctoral degree. And in the process, my problem statement was really, why are the citizens of more developed Western democracies so disengaged? And are there platforms out there that once you engage with them, make you want to participate with political institutions and just politics in general more? And so as I was doing my research, the kind of the deficits that my research kind of cohered around, and I think we still use at FIDE North America since we launched last year, are really threefold. One of them is this very, very minimalistic definition that we have of our democracies and the way in which that, especially when you speak to residents across the United States, if you ask them about their voice and how they exercise their voice, you will often hear, not always, but you will often hear that it's through their vote. And so I think that we need to think a little bit more expansively about sort of that space in between elections. And so we talk very often about sort of beyond the ballot box and making sure that there are platforms for people to be meaningfully engaged in between elections. The second deficits that we talk about quite often is this kind of lack of policy congruence, which essentially means that we are asking residents, more and more citizens of the United States and other places, to live and observe laws, regulations every day that don't necessarily align with their policy preferences. And so at FIDE, we say we like to put the public back into public policy and give average citizens a place at the table so that their preferences can be reflected in the policies that they have to observe on a day-to-day basis. And then finally, and this is one that is very near and dear to my heart, as Ted also mentioned, and that is voice. The idea that people do not have adequate voice. And I introduced the term voice insecurity in my book, which at the time I just introduced and didn't really think very much of, which is a big problem. But we are now actually working on a briefing document that we will be releasing by the end of the summer around sort of what we mean and how we define voice insecurity. And what we mean by that, in essence, is that people do not have adequate platforms where they can provide meaningful input. I mean, all of us, I live in Washington, D.C., and I do go to my town halls and I try to be engaged in my community, but I don't always feel that my voice is really heard and that my input actually matters. And I don't feel that my representatives are really accountable for providing me with feedback on the ways in which they have used my input. So interestingly, I'd like to also stop for a minute and just share with you that when we speak to elected representatives, and we launched FIDE last year, I'll speak very briefly about what we do at FIDE, but when we speak to electeds, and these are, whether they're mayors or governors we talk to, what we hear from them generally in terms of how they see their engagement as not working very well are five different factors. The first one is the issues around polarization and dis and misinformation. electeds themselves don't feel like their residents are actually being provided balanced information. That's one big problem. The second problem that we see is what I alluded to earlier, which is they also recognize that there is a lack of alignment between their constituent preferences and policies. And they are also seeking input in ways to be able to find buy in, to be able to get a sense of where their residents' sort of preferences lie. And then, of course, there's the issue around loneliness and lack of belonging. I think electeds are very also well aware of this pervasive epidemic of loneliness that we have across the country, and they see that their communities are not as actively as engaged as they used to be. And then, kind of tied to that, is also the problem of the usual suspects. Every elected that I talk to says, how can I get a more diverse range of residents to come and meet with me, to provide me with their input? Basically, what they feel is either those usual suspects are people that agree with them or people who completely disagree with them. And they would like to hear from a more diverse kind of and more marginalized voices as well. And then finally, and this is generally comes up, is the lack of trust that they feel. And so they are looking for ways to be able to enhance levels of trust with not just themselves, but also political institutions more generally. And so, what is the solution to all of this? So, I knew about deliberative democracy. I didn't know very much about citizens' assemblies, and I became familiar with them about 5 or 6 years ago. And so my book, as Ted very kindly suggested, is called Activated Citizenship, and it is a case study of 4 different assemblies. Since then, I've been involved with almost 12 assemblies, which I'm happy to share more about. But essentially, in the time that I have, maybe I'll just share with you what we refer to as the 4 key components of a citizens' assembly. The very first one is that government needs to be involved. For us, government needs to commission an assembly. There needs to be a public problem, a thorny, pesky problem that government wants real, meaningful input around, and they want to get that input from their residents. So that's number one. Number two is, and Ted mentioned this as well, is it's not a sign up sheet. We use a 2-tiered system called democratic lottery or sortition to make sure that we have a representative sampling of that community at the table. And I will say at this point, having worked in citizen engagement for almost 20 years, there is truly no process that brings as representative a sampling of residents to the table. Is it perfect? No. Are there things that we need to do to sort of study this, examine it, reflect on it, tweak it? Absolutely. And I'm happy to talk about that more if there's interest from all of you. And then there's the process. So the process, every citizens assembly has 3 phases. The first one, and this is one of the reasons why I was really drawn to assemblies, is the learning phase. So before people come together and argue and debate and yell and scream, they learn together. And that process is absolutely delightful to be part of. Of course, the curation of the evidence, again, is a complicated piece of this, but when it's done well, they will be hearing from a diverse range of experts. And when we say experts, some are academics, some are community stakeholders and leaders, and also people with lived experience on that topic that we're asking them to come and deliberate on. And then the second phase is deliberation. And so at that point, in plenary session, in large groups, and also in small group discussions, they start deliberating and proposals start to emerge. Finally, and this is the third phase, they will then write proposals. So it's not just a response to how they feel about something and what their position is, but they actually do draft proposals, which then are sort of put together in a final report with a minority section, usually, to make sure that all voices are included. And that final report, and this is the fourth key component, is then submitted to the same championing body that commissioned the assembly. And we will typically ask that body, when it receives the final report, to explain when they're going to respond to the assembly members and the public at large, and explain what they're adopting, what they're not adopting, and sort of provide explanations as much as they can. So that's kind of what an assembly is. And I see that I don't have too much time. So I would like to talk about the way in which we talk about impact. But before I do that, I'll just mention that, in the few years that I have been involved in the citizen assembly space, mostly abroad, um, it is incredible how interest has grown in the United States. And so last year, last April, so a year and a little bit ago, we launched FIDE, which is the Federation for Innovation in Democracy North America. We have a sister organization in Brussels that has been doing incredible work for the past 5 years, and we work very closely with them. Our work is basically falls within 3 or 4 kind of budget buckets, but we do advocacy and awareness raising campaigns with mostly in partnership with a lot of great organizations across the US. The second piece of what we do is we have capacity building schools. And so just last week, we had a capacity building school in Akron, Ohio, with about 42 people from 9 states and 12 cities across the US this time. And it's an incredible opportunity for people who are interested to come and learn kind of the building blocks of an assembly over 2 days, and also to build a network with others who are interested in this work and to meet with other experts who are also doing this great work across the United States. Part of that is also then providing technical guidance to cities. So we will hold the hands of cities across their design and implementation of a citizens assembly. And the list of cities that are doing this work is really growing. Our partners, as Ted mentioned, there used to be the first citizens assembly, real citizens assembly in the United States was in Petaluma, California. Since we've had a citizens assembly in Bend, Oregon, Fort Collins, and Boulder, Colorado is in the process of doing an assembly on 15-minute neighborhoods, and we're quite involved with Boulder. Other cities are also in the very early stages of designing and hopefully implementing later this year and next year. And then the other really big piece of what we do is a learning series. So we will, at no cost to projects, help them develop, or independently, of course, we will hire a local PhD student who will do an independent evaluation of the assemblies. And this will, over time, allow us to have some case studies across the citizens' assemblies with some comparative data. Now, in the last few minutes that I have, and I don't want to go over my time, the way in which we see impact and the way in which we talk about impact that we see from citizens' assemblies is really fourfold. So we talk about individual impact, we talk about societal impact, we talk about policy impact, and we talk about institutional impact. And just very quickly, and then I'm happy to talk about this more in the Q&A, but the individual impact, of course, is to what extent do people learn more about the topic, but also about government? To what extent do they feel more empowered? Do they feel that they have a more of a sense of agency and voice, as I mentioned? On the societal front, it's mostly the community level that we see and those bonds that are formed, as Ted mentioned, and those bonds that continue after the Citizens Assembly and actually have ripple effects across communities as well as the really, really important piece that we don't talk about often enough, which is collective problem solving skills. We do believe at FIDE that we've lost that ability to collectively solve problems. And so we do see with citizens assemblies that people leave as a community, as a whole, just feeling stronger about that very important skill. Um, on the policy side, better decision making, collective decision making, of course, the emergence of collective intelligence, and then, as I said earlier, the greater alignment of policy preferences and policies, laws, and regulations. And then finally, institutional. And here I'll just mention that we do see when citizens' assemblies are designed well and implemented well, which I have to say is not always the case. And we often at FIDE will say that there is a difference between the potential of assemblies and the practice of assemblies. So I want to be clear that I don't think that every assembly is designed and implemented well, but when they are implemented and designed well, we see enhanced transparency, enhanced legitimacy, and of course, trust as well. And there I'll just say before I end that we often talk about trust as mutual trust. I think that it's really, really important to also acknowledge that as residents and citizens' trust in government is low, I also believe that government doesn't really trust residents in the ways that we would like to see them trust. And ultimately, we also want to talk about trust in oneself, because what I see, which is really a magical and transformative part of assemblies, is that people come out of an assembly with a greater sense of the ways in which they can actually participate in their democracies. And I look forward to any questions after. Thank you so much, Josh.
Uh, thank you so much, Marjan. That was very inspiring and informative. just covering so many areas. And it, you know, for us, anyway, it's confirming about the many ways that people are learning together and empowering themselves to be able to make decisions and deal with conflict. So thank you. All right. And now I would like to turn to our filmmaker from Scotland, though he's in France as we speak, Patrick Chalmers. Can you turn your video on, Patrick? There we go. All right. And he informed me at the beginning that I gave him an assignment, and I'm going to reiterate the systematic use of citizens' assemblies in governance, probability, or pipe dream. All right. Patrick, take it away.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Ted. Thank you, Marjan, as well. So Josh just read out the question. I think it's worth reading out again. The systematic use of citizens' assemblies in governance. Probability or pipe dream? Well, short answer, and I say this with respect to our two hosts, and my unsatisfactory answer to that would be, I'm not sure that's the right question. And for those who do want an answer to that question, I will recommend other people's work, not my own. But I would also say what I reckon is the right question today, because what we're talking about is politics. And my motivation as a filmmaker and someone who still identifies as a journalist, I would say that the question that's bothering me is how do we respond to our multiple political crises? And obviously, citizens' assemblies live within that. So back to the question itself, for those who do want an answer, the work I'd recommend from my own experience is David van der Heijbroek's Against Election book. That inspired me to make films about citizens' assemblies. There's Terry Borisius. I'm sure the North American world will know that. He's shortly to publish. He's done it online already. The Trouble with Elections. And in fact, I think Terry's work inspired a chapter of David's, so one relates to the other. Then, of course, there's Marjan's Activated Citizenship. I haven't read it, though what stood out from the publisher's text was the following, and I'll read it out. The paragraph on the publisher's page. Activated citizenship urges the deliberative community to be more discerning and intentional to more positively impact participants' knowledge, sense of community, enthusiasm, political engagement, as well as their sense of meaningful voice. So I think that would be great. However, the deliberative community is tiny. It absolutely is tiny in this world of 8 billion, and I know that because I'm part of it. I also know that Marjan's career, her experience, her knowledge, what I can guess from of her personal story, makes her far better placed than me and more knowledgeable to talk about the technicalities of assemblies. So I'm not going to do that here. Also, Marjan, as a woman, as a fluent Farsi speaker, she's also better placed than me to talk about broken politics, quite honestly. However, I have got something to bring to this, and that is as a political obsessive of 40 years or so now. I'm 59 now, and I have been that political obsessive for probably 4 decades, maybe even longer. And this is where I disagree with Marjan from my sense of what she said, which is that although we both want to get to the same place, I think where we differ is how we get there. From what I've seen over the last decade, or 4 decades of following politics way too closely, is that there's no chance that citizens' assemblies are going to be mainstreamed by political parties winning elections and then replacing electoral systems with deliberative ones. I don't think that's going to happen. So this difference with Marjan is on theory of change, not on the merits of assemblies themselves. And arguing for assemblies from a place of logic, we should have them because they produce better policy results than elections, won't get us more genuine assemblies or better policies for the world's majorities. And I'm living as a foreigner in a foreign country, to me, and so I'm thinking about the world's majorities, even though I moved from one rich country to another. To be thinking and arguing for assemblies from a place of logic, it reminds me of my fellow countryman, the late Sean Connery, the character he played in the 1987 movie The Untouchables. He ridicules a would-be assassin for bringing a knife to a gunfight. And despite carrying a double-barreled shotgun himself, he doesn't survive long. In fact, he dies soon after making that taunt. So let's be clear, guns apart and jokes about fellow Scotsmen, I am for peaceful transformations to better politics, absolutely. However, in order to get there, this peaceful transformation, we need more sustained and I would say cunning plans rooted in street-savvy reality of politics, if we're ever to get better politics. And that's because sustained and cunning plans are exactly what keeps status quo power in place. Sustained and cunning plans maintained for generations, not for months or years. And plenty of dirty and lethal tricks too, if all else fails. Let's not kid ourselves. And that's the challenge facing all campaigns for positive political change. And I believe the campaign for citizens' assemblies is exactly that. And looking out today on the world, boy, don't we need more positive? Because our political reality right now is a world of multiple crises, wildfire authoritarianism, and it's on the rise. Far from ushering in more citizens' assemblies, our elected leaders are busy pouring fuel on the flames of war and clamping down on civil liberties and dissent. And that's in the electoral democracies. And I don't say this to be daring or controversial. It's just what's happening. It shouldn't surprise us either. And this is where I'm going to be daring, controversial, or triggering. But again, it's as a science, I have a science background. So as a science, we look at the evidence. And from the evidence, major electoral democracies like my native UK, or the United States, or the others, have abused state powers for decades, if not centuries. And it's what you do when you're stealing other people's stuff, other people's land, their resources. Our elected government's work hasn't been to strengthen other countries' political structures, or their domestic ones for that matter, but rather to subvert and undermine them. Again, I know that's controversial, but if you look, you find the fingerprints of misused British and American power all over the planet. Those of imperial powers like France, Spain, Belgium, Portugal, the Netherlands, and Germany, they're all pretty evident as well, their fingerprints. So several centuries of this behavior and its version in non-occupied form, more financial than physical, has brought us the multiple systemic crises that we face as Homo sapiens today. So ones such as climate heating, I've reported on that as a journalist, or species collapse, I've reported on that as well, or rampant inequality between the few very rich and the majority poor, or growing militarization and geopolitical threats, including nuclear war. NATO is about to raise its budget to 5% of GDP on weapons, or evaporating civil liberties. All of these are underpinned by elections, often with no effective alternatives for citizens to choose from. And I come from the UK, so I've seen that through several elections. So for all the promise of assemblies, and they do hold promise, they are critically vulnerable to capture by the very power centers they threaten with that promise. In the UK and France, so the UK where I was born and France where I live, citizens' assemblies play no meaningful role at the top tables of political power. They have had them, but they've not broken through. Status quo power and its tiny circle of maximum beneficiaries keeps a brutal check on anything that would dilute that power. And the United States, despite, not I personally dream of fairer government for all humans. I dream of a planet where our collective aim is universal human dignity, with all people living lives in safety, with access to decent shelter, to food, education, healthcare. I dream of a planet where humans behave as wise custodians but out of a living whole and with eyes for generations ahead. But it's not going to happen overnight, of course, and it's not going to happen without a sustained campaign to make it happen. But it's not impossible, and deliberative tools such as assemblies could actually help us get there. So how? I'd say a couple of things, and that is the essence of where we got to at All Hands On. So the first is personal, and I think this one will resonate for the people on the call who are familiar with restorative justice. So this is personal rather than community level of restorative justice. And that's really the idea that we as individuals need to get real about our limited knowledge and engagement in political reality, as well as our poorly developed political skills. It's not an abstract thing. We need to learn the skills of listening to different views, to our own, and cultivating the capacity to change our views and to cherish difference rather than reject it in polarized thought bubbles. So that's what citizens' assemblies do. So we do like them. But it's also deeper than that, these political skills. It's rooted in our unconscious. And again, that's familiar to the restorative justice community. It's rooted in our lived experiences, our historical received habits from our parents and our ancestors. It needs us ultimately to heal ourselves from a psychotherapeutic perspective. And that starts in our homes, it starts with our partners, it starts with our families, it starts with our communities. It's real work of self-healing. We think Carl Rogers, think Thomas Hübel. At a higher level, and this is what peacemakers either know already in their bones because they're peacemakers, or they have to learn fast if they're to last as peacemakers, is these skills of recognizing the other and transforming and accepting the other, generating compassion for the other. And that's why our latest film project, which is called Making Peace with Politics, a deliberate play on words, has us in Israel and Palestine, learning from real-world peacemakers facing real-world war. And I realize the risk of confusion from me saying the three words real-world war together. I mean it with a hyphen in there, and I hope it stays there. Those peacemakers model the qualities and practices the world needs to learn to connect us with others. Our superpower should be to avoid falling into antagonistic camps of good versus bad, right versus left, one people or faith versus another. Our secret weapon, not so secret, is creating communities of communication where difference is welcome. And we'll show that on film, inviting audiences to learn and deploy such skills themselves where they live in their own lives. Our screening model for films, which we've developed from where we were before, brings us to the second element that we need, which is the one we need for a more sustainable planet, a livable planet, and that's movement building. Our contribution is to use the films we co-create with communities as movement building tools. That work starts with story conception and continues through production into screenings and then beyond. Because movements are the only things that ever brought sustained progressive changes on our planet. We've had African Americans fighting to end slavery and then for civil rights. We've had liberation movements fighting off the formal colonialism of my ancestors. As a Scotsman, we were colonized and colonizers. That's why I have this posh accent. We've had the suffragettes and their sisters worldwide fighting for women's votes. More recently, we had Black Lives Matter, we've had Pride, we've had Me Too. And it's woke, all right, because we all need to wake up. Using our collective wisdom as Homo sapiens, which is what citizens' assemblies do at their best, is how we could get there, or at least part of it. But don't ask me. I'm obviously one of we 8 billion people and counting. How we do that. We're doing our tiny bit at All Hands On, and you're absolutely welcome to join us and find out more. But we need a planet load of people doing their things too. So that's the idea. Yeah?
Great. All right. Thank you, Patrick. And I'll invite Marjan back on. So wonderful. We've heard a lot. I want to invite, first of all, If you have questions in the audience, this is your time. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of a laptop screen. It works a little different on mobile. But if you want to use that Q&A and type in your questions for our panelists or in general, and if you have thoughts that you want to share, it's fine to use the chat for that as well. That's often feed into what we discuss. Um, and so we'll use the rest of the hour for discussion uh, about these things and any questions you have. And I also just want to say now that at the top of the hour, we will put a link in the chat to another Zoom room if you'd like to join us for some small group discussions. We'll do that for about 30 minutes after we're all done here. So, all right. So, well, first of all, any responses? Ted, you got any thoughts?
Well, I was, delighted at sort of the combination of ideas that we have here today. And I think being challenging about citizens' assemblies being sufficient is not per se challenging citizens' assemblies, but recognizing the limits of what they can do as long as people are still unfamiliar with them, still doubting whether you can trust what happens in them. I mean, all of that is part of, well, first of all, the filmmaking is a great way to do it, but the more demonstrations, the more times that it's happened, I think will build confidence and that will give them more clout. But the idea that the political establishment is going to suddenly give up its power to citizens who want to chat is not likely. And so obviously it's a complicated uh, it's complicated to change the world, and it's hard, and we're going to have to, you know, think this through together, like I think we're doing, and people do it, democracy R&D meetings, and what I'm excited about is sort of emerging of settings of innovation. So Josh and I, and actually someone who's here on the in the audience, my friend Lee Rush, who was the first person I worked with years ago with troubled youth. We've been interested in a thing called Braver Angels here in the United States. Some of you may be familiar with them, but they build themselves as anti-polarization. They describe themselves as leaning red, leaning blue, which is an interesting vocabulary to use. I've written a little thing on my website. If you look at we have a few things now. Last, well, was it last month or so ago? We had guests on our last webinar who had participated in Braver Angels. And the whole idea of, I guess the word healing is what triggered me when you said that, Patrick. That's part of the healing. And it's really nice to see that effort growing in the United States, but also starting to notice citizens' assemblies. And so and well, restorative practices for me is an older strand than deliberative democracy in a sense for my personal experience. But in the same way, recognizing that there are ways that we can make decisions, reduce conflict on a micro scale, and seeing that as closely related to excuse me, to the whole to the several threads of activity. So I'm encouraged by the multiple possibilities.
Marjan, I think you wanted to make some comments.
Sure, I'm happy to make a few comments. First of all, like how could I disagree with everything that Patrick said? Like beautifully put. And I agree with most everything you said, Patrick, 100%. And I will just say that, for many of us who work exclusively in the Citizens Assembly space, we do not think that it's a panacea. We do not see it as a silver bullet. We do not think that it is going to solve all of our problems. But we do see it as a complement and a way to strengthen the current system that we are all living in. I also have to mention on this call that, you know, especially over the past several months, as someone who is working towards a vision of our future democracy, that it can be much more inviting and much more inspiring for Americans, I'm also every day facing the fact that there are far bigger fires that need to be kind of addressed this today. And so I think that there is a tension there for many of us who are working in this space currently. But I just, more generally, I think that, our theory of change, Patrick, I don't think is very different. Um, I think for us at FIDE, one piece is that we do work towards our ultimate goal is to try and repair the relationship between citizens and government. And we see this as a complement, as a way to strengthen that relationship. Having said that, I do not think that citizens' assemblies are working. And I kind of mentioned this earlier as well. I do think that, as you mentioned, they are prone to capture, and that is a real problem. And I think that that really has a lot to do with design, that has a lot to do with making sure that we workshop assemblies very well at the beginning. And so there are a lot of different pieces that need to be set in motion. And also, just more fundamentally, the fact that, there's a lot of conversation around citizens' assemblies and participation washing, which I've seen myself, the selection of topic. Why don't we have participants themselves and assembly members in the broader community select the topic that they're going to be addressing? Why don't we have citizens on governance committees? Why don't we have them more often on the curation of evidence? And we at FIDE are very much trying to promote that so that we see more of a real shift in power. So to me, that's the more long-term theory of change. But I will just end with this, that I do think where we might differ, and I'm not sure that we do, but our short-term then theory of change is more about encouraging experimentation. And I think that does that mean that all citizens' assemblies are up to a standard that we get really excited around? Not necessarily. But what it does mean, and it goes back to what you mentioned around sort of the personal level and the impact on the personal level, regardless of the assembly and how poorly or how well it was organized and implemented, people are still leaving them feeling more empowered. They feel like they have found a place for themselves in their democracy, even if trust in government lowers, which happens, right? But they feel like they have more trust in themselves. And so, so that's just a few comments that I just wanted to make.
Cool. Josh, I see a couple of questions. Just does anybody want to? Well, anyway, I'll just say it. The whole idea of capture. Somebody asks about
Oh,
that.
yeah.
I mean, to me, the classic example that I first heard of was Macron essentially holding a citizen assembly and then deciding what counted sort of unilaterally, which essentially, he could use it as a public relations tool, and isn't he open and wonderful, but he also was very manipulative about it. Essentially, it was captured. Is that a fair? Any other, somebody add to the definition or other examples?
I mean, I'm curious to hear what Patrick thinks. So I was very involved in the second French Convention on the end of life. The first one, I was a researcher at the end of the process. The second one, I was involved from the beginning to the end as one of four international experts on it. So I think the issue there, he actually made this promise to the French people. Like it was a campaign promise that he made to the French people, and they responded to it. That he would engage in a national debate around the issue of euthanasia and assisted suicide and whether the law should change. I think the real problem became when there were protests around pension reform, and people in the assembly were also questioning why they're not addressing that issue as well, right? And so I don't feel that the convention on the end of life was co-opted, and in fact the Assemblée nationale just 2 weeks ago voted in favor of the change in the law. It took a while, but they did. I think it was more a question of the selection of the topic. Like, why are we engaging with this topic when there are other topics that we would also like to address? But that's my impression.
I was actually thinking of the first one, the climate thing, as more. That was my impression through the media that uh, it was not as
He
I
made
thought.
promises that he didn't keep. I'm not sure that it was co-opted or captured.
Okay,
Mm. Okay, so capture would mean the process was controlled as opposed to allowed to go through the full procedure that would allow for the voice of all the people. So that's what you would be by capture. Um, so let me try. There's a lot of comments, but let me try to pull a question together. Jane Mansbridge, who we're so pleased to have on the call, commented, um, Marjan, are you suggesting that citizens' assemblies replace legislature? Patrick suggested this implicitly. I thought that the model you're promoting is advisory with commitments from legislative and administrative branch to implement the recommendations or give a principled justification why not. Um, I just the other day, yesterday maybe, I listened to a podcast from Hannah Arendt Center, and Roger Berkowitz was interviewing James Fishkin, and he asked the question kind of along these lines, like, the deliberative polling is a deliberative process where you find out what the people are thinking, whereas a citizens' assembly empowers people to actually have the power, perhaps in some cases, to make a decision. And Roger was saying, I think both things are important to find out what is the will of the people and also give them the experience of what it's like to have power. So yeah, maybe there's different issues at play here, but I don't know. Maybe you both could comment on where you see these different components fitting in. Patrick, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. My metric for the French Citizens Assembly is the people I speak to. The French, I'm British. The French are way more street level politicized than the Brits. And in fact, I'd say my experience of the Greeks is that they're a whole level further even than the French. I was lucky enough to do a film in Athens as well. So my sense of the French, just as you talk about citizens' assemblies, is that our dear president talked about sans filtre, so that he would apply the results of the citizens' assembly sans filtre, without being, linguist. That means without filter. So he would basically transfer what was agreed into legislation, and that would take place. And he didn't. You know, he did exactly what Ted described. And so when I speak to French people about citizens' assemblies, they laugh at me or they shrug their Gallic shoulders. So the case for citizens' assemblies has been wrecked in France, wrecked. And it was wrecked by the president. Someone put not captured, castrated. And I laughed, because it's been wrecked. So if you were to try to have a citizens' assembly, and Marjan talks about the end of life one, it's great. That got through, and bluntly, it's still, although the separation of church and state exists in France, it's still quite a deeply Catholic country. So that it got through is quite impressive, because I think the human case for end of life is very strong. So well done, the Citizens' Assembly, for doing that. But it is not an issue that threatens status quo power in the way that climate change and the fossil fuel industries, or the farming industry as well, is massive here. Transport and all the rest. So I sort of think we have to call a spade, and captured was exactly what happened in France, and I think to a large extent also in the UK, with a very serious subject, which is global heating, climate change.
Marjan?
Sure. So I differ in my assessment from Patrick. I do think that he made promises, and the sans filtre is a great example of that. Macron did that, he didn't keep, and we saw that trust was lower. I mean, my research, and it's in my book, my research shows that people trusted government less as a result of process. But I wouldn't then sort of qualify the idea of assemblies in France as having been wrecked. And I'll just sort of posit two reasons why I say that. One is, with the assembly on the end of life, we were able to recruit 185 French people from across the country who stayed with us throughout the process. We lost one person because that one person didn't have a job and had to leave. So we had 184 people from all over the country come to Paris over 27 days. So to me, that's not a wrecked system. I think people still believe, people still want to volunteer, and now they've just launched a third citizens convention at the national level. The other piece that I would say is mayors across France are using citizens' assemblies in their campaigns, and we're seeing them in various cities across France. And the city of Paris also now has a permanent citizens' assembly. Um, so I wouldn't say I will always say that are we perfect? Are these being processed and sort of designed and implemented as perfectly as they can? No. Are there problems that we need to address? Absolutely. But I wouldn't say that the idea of assemblies has been wrecked amongst French people that I talk to and I see being involved. Um, to Jenny's point, yes, absolutely. We talk about this in partnership with government. This is not for as a replacement to our representative democracies. And we do talk about them as being advisory, though I would love to see at some point that proposals are not just advisory, but that are binding. Maybe, whether they meet a certain threshold or, there's just an agreement that they are more than advisory. I also would love to see, and we're testing with this, I'd love to see an appeal process where assembly members can actually appeal the decision of a government to implement or not implement certain proposals. But those are not happening currently. And then finally, just Josh, to your point about deliberative town halls, just two quick things, and I see that the time, I don't want to talk too much, but one is I think the process of deliberative town halls. I agree with James Fishkent that we should have all of these processes. And I often find in America that it's always like this or that. Well, no, I think our mentality should be and. Um, and I think that, there are differences though. I mean, deliberative town halls and citizens' assemblies. And the reason I'm drawn to assemblies is because the time for deliberation is far superior. The learning is, I believe, is far superior. So the process is far more prolonged. And then the deliverable also, the fact that we're asking citizens to come together and write proposals together is what also to me is quite unique about the citizens assembly process.
Thank
So
you.
we're down to 3 minutes. How do you want to use that, Joshua?
I know. I'm trying to figure that out. And I just got two more comments coming online. Well, I will say someone noted here, uh, Larry Schooler saw stats that 30% of citizens' assemblies saw all decisions turned into policy, 30% saw at least 50% of decisions turned into policy, and was asking if there were any specific to US stats. I don't know if you're familiar with that. No. But you know, Dad, you've often talked about influence versus authority. Um, I don't know, do you want to
Well, yeah, just real quickly, for me, I saw Fishkin's early work in Texas, in a state that was seen as the original gas and oil state, go through eight citizens assemblies with eight different selected groups from different public utility areas, and it resulted, at least my perception is, from 1960 98 when he did those, Texas was number 49 in alternative energy, announced number one, um, because everyone was stunned that Texans said, yes, we want more alternative energy. We're going to pay for it. And he had something like a 70% shift in people's opinions once they got more information and had a chance to talk. So can it affect policy? Maybe we need to hold more of them. Maybe, it needs to be a drumbeat of policy decisions. I don't know, but it's all very exciting. And I'm so thankful to the people who showed up here, not just on our webinar, but also those who came in the audience. Thank you so much for showing up. Oh,
Yeah,
tell them about our next step here, Josh.
I just put it in the chat. So we're going to invite you to a half hour of small group discussions, and I will keep putting that in the chat. But while we're arranging that, I would just like to say a great thank you to Patrick and to Marjan. I think this was a really meaningful discussion. We got into a lot of issues. I know people have a lot of questions. There were great comments. So thank you all. We will be, this has been recorded. It may take a couple days or a week, hopefully not that long, maybe tomorrow if I'm on the ball. we'll mail this out, and you can share this with folks. And you know, we're going to be doing more around this work. So thank you all for joining
Thank
us.
thank you so much for having us. This was wonderful.